It's an absolute pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon to this very important event in the life of Kalamazoo College, the annual Florence J. Lucasse Lecture. It is wonderful to look out and see so many emeritus faculty, so many students, so many visitors from our community. This event really celebrates the life of the mind at Kalamazoo College, and we welcome all of you here today. This afternoon, our lecture will be delivered by the 2013 recipient of the Florence J. Lucasse Fellowship Award for Excellence in Scholarship, Dr. Carol Anderson, Professor of Religion here at the college. We're delighted to honor you this afternoon. The Florence J. Lucasse Lectureship and the Florence J. Lucasse Fellowship were established in 1979 to honor Florence J. Lucasse, an alumna of the college, in recognition of her long and distinguished career. The awards were established through a bequest from Mrs. Lucasse, which she provided for in her will. Her generosity awards two distinct honors, one of which is given each year. The Florence J. Lucasse Fellowship, which we are celebrating today, recognizes a member of the Kalamazoo College faculty for outstanding achievement in creative work, research, and publication. The Florence J. Lucasse Lectureship recognizes a member of the Kalamazoo College faculty in recognition of outstanding classroom teaching. In addition to the honor of being recognized by faculty peers and presenting the Lucasse Lecture, each awardee also receives a monetary gift. The recipient is recommended to the president by a selection committee composed of faculty, including many past Lucasse winners. This group carefully considers each of the nominations that have been submitted by the faculty and reviews each nominee's evidence of sustained excellence in teaching or scholarly endeavors. Final approval is given by the Kalamazoo College Board of Trustees. We're honored this afternoon to have with us Carol's partner, Annie McCombs. Annie, will you please stand so we can recognize you? Her friends, Fred and Joe Cunningham. Fred and Joe. And some of you will recognize the names. They are Karen Cunningham's parents. We also have Betty and Henry Cohen. Betty and Henry, please stand. Cecilia Moore. Cecilia, good family friend. Stacy Petrie and Taylor Petrie. And Russell Rhodes, spouse of Karen Cunningham. You can tell that Carol is intricately entwined in the faculty and in her community when you see the guests who've come to honor her this afternoon. We thank you for joining us as we honor Dr. Anderson. I'd like to now call on the provost who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. Carol Anderson truly represents the best in what the Florence J. Lucasse Fellowship stands for. Someone who has demonstrated sustained excellence in her scholarly and creative work and has become recognized regionally, nationally, even internationally in her field. With a BA in religion from the University of Puget Sound and an MA in religious studies and a PhD in the history of religion from the University of Chicago Divinity School, Carol has been on the faculty here at Kalamazoo since 1993. She was promoted to full professor in 2008, and in 2009-2010 served as the interim director of the ARCA Center for Social Justice Leadership. Her published work includes 2 books and numerous peer-reviewed articles, And she has also given many invited lectures and presentations and presented numerous national and international conference papers. She has taught no fewer than 2.5 dozen courses in religious studies, women, gender, and sexuality, and international and area studies. Carol, I offer you my sincere congratulations on an honor much deserved. Now, to read a citation for Carol that further elucidates her scholarly and service impact, it is my pleasure to introduce Assistant Professor of Religion, Dr. Shreena Gandhi.
So this is 20 years. I didn't realize that, so congratulations on that, too. It is said that the Buddha visited the island of Sri Lanka 3 times during his lifetime, Mahayangana, Nagadipa, and Kalenia. During each of these visits, he resolved disputes between warring factions, left behind relics, and gained followers. In each of these places, the Buddha made an impact and laid the foundation for Buddhism in Sri Lanka. At least this is how the myths go. And these myths are crystallized in the form of stupas, statues, narratives, comic books, pilgrimages, and rituals. These myths show that the Buddha was not just a man who reached enlightenment, but also a mediator, a scholar, a teacher, a pragmatist, a miracle worker, and advisor. Given this mythological richness, it's quite fitting that Carol Anderson chose to study Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Like the Buddha, Carol seems to pop up all over Kalamazoo College and the larger academic world of religious studies. She has branched out into other fields of inquiry beyond Buddhism, making an impact in scholarship on women, feminism, queer studies, and social justice. She is distinctive and yet has this uncanny ability to talk and mix with anyone. And whether it is through the American Academy of Religion or her own department, Carol is a mentor and teacher to younger scholars like no other. She is patient, firm, generous, and teaches by example. It is for these reasons that today we honor Carol Anderson with the Lucasse Fellowship. Her scholarship is varied, well-recognized, meticulous, and theoretically innovative. Carol's work reminds us that texts, genders, and borders have histories. Their relevance throughout history is contingent upon the power structures of the time, and in many ways both reifies and defies power and hegemony. While her books, articles, and conference presentations may be geographically and subject-specific, her analysis makes her a relevant citation beyond her subfields, and that is what makes her a versatile and compelling scholar in religious studies and the larger academic world. Has Carol quelled arguments between the Nagas and Yakas like Buddha did in Sri Lanka? No, but her wit, scholarly accomplishments, teaching innovations, globetrotting research, and mentorships make her a legend and certainly part of the history of Kalamazoo College. There might not be rituals and pilgrimages in the future, but her permanent impact on the Department of Religion, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, Social Justice, and Kalamazoo College secures her place in our mythology. Thank you.
I'm really nervous, and now it's even worse. And Paul, this is really what I was opting for the new building, right? You know, stupa from Sri Lanka. Yeah, you know, at least we've got some Indian images and so on here, but you know, some of these slides I had you in mind when I pulled them together. So yeah, you guys, thank you so much. I am honored. I'm humbled. Nervous, right? And it's really quite amazing to have all of you here. And I know that I haven't had a chance to say hello to everybody, but I hope we can do that over the next few days. So thank you so much. And let me tell you, for somebody, you know, Shreena, you're right, I have you know, done a lot of conference papers, but this is the audience that makes me the most nervous, right? Joe's sitting there, Larissa's here, somehow I'm supposed to talk about what I do, to a really diverse group, but I'm very glad to be here. And if you'll indulge me for the next half an hour or so, I think I hope to entertain you a little bit and also have some good conversations over the next few days after we're done. I would first like to thank any number of you for all of your support and assistance with what I call my research, right? I can say with certainty that the intellectual work that I have done, the questions I have asked of the religious traditions I study, and the writings that I have published reflect the conversations that I have had with many of you over the years. So I would like to begin these remarks with a sincere thank you to President Wilson Oyalaran and Provost McDonald for the support and the encouragement and the pat on the back and, oh yeah, you had a book come out in front of the faculty meeting, all of those things. It really makes a huge difference to all of us on the faculty. Thanks also go to Professors Petrie and Gandhi for loving what you teach, for respecting the work that we do in the religion department, for being willing to talk about frustrations in translating and with editors. We've had conversations about editors over the last few weeks. And also for reading drafts of my conference papers that really haven't quite gelled. These two are just, they're wonderful readers. And I really am so respectful and appreciative of the work we do in our department. So thank you for that. Now, when our senior seminar in religion met at the beginning of January, the first class period, and you guys will remember this, we were going over the assignments that we do for the rest of the term. The first assignment I told them was one that I had to write with them, an intellectual autobiography, if you will. I told them about this award, and I admitted then that I had no real idea of what I was going to say, or how I was going to go about writing this paper. We then, did what teachers do. We turned that into a discussion about how one writes an intellectual genealogy, and weaves one's stories into one's lives. Now, at the end of the quarter, only a couple of weeks ago, I had to acknowledge that I had written nothing. Absolutely nothing. They asked me, said, so Dr. Anderson, is your paper done? I said, no. I said, what everybody always says, I said, I've thought a lot about it. So this paper is really for you guys in the senior seminar. This is how I spent my spring break, right? And I would like to thank all of you in the seminar for the conversations we had last term. It was the first time in 20 years that I've ever taught our senior seminar for a variety of reasons. And it was a wonderful way. The wide-ranging discussions we had about religion, about colonialism, Joe, baseball, right? They were a really useful way for me to think and reflect on the work that I've done in religion over the past some 30-odd years. I need also to thank Liz Smith. Liz, where are you? Yeah, there you are, right? Liz Smith is one of the most delightful colleagues with whom I share a fascination and passion for research. She's wonderful. She can come into any religion class I teach and tell students how to do research on it. And I email her with weird questions about articles by Wendy Donaker and Joseph Campbell, and 10 minutes later she's found it and sent it to me. So I need to really thank you. But I also need to thank Liz for a conversation we had right after I learned that I got this award last fall. I ran into her immediately because I ducked out of the reception because I had to go teach, and I ran into her while I was waiting for the elevator. And she said, so, how you doing? She said, congratulations, how you doing? I said, yeah, I have to do this talk. And she said, Carol, all we want is we just want to hear what you do. And so, Liz, that's really become my mantra over the last few months, and it's sort of gotten me through writing this talk and thinking about how to share what it is that I do with you. Now, if you will indulge, there we go, okay. This is a script called Devanagari. It's actually written in Pali. This is what I do. I read weird languages like this. These sentences actually are found in a collection of texts known as the Tipitaka, or the three baskets of the Pali canon. These religious scriptures fall into three categories. The first is what the tradition has remembered the Buddha to say, or the Sutta Pitaka. All of you in the Buddhism class, we did this on Monday? Okay. The second group of texts are the further teachings, or the Abhidhamma Pitaka. These are abstracted logic that stands behind the sayings of the Buddha. And the third category in the Tipitaka is the Vinaya Pitaka, which are the rules for the monastic order of monks and nuns. Now, the passages that I want to walk you through this afternoon, and it's actually my latest research project. I've got about 200 pages in different fragments that I have to figure out how to put together into a manuscript. And so the passages I'm walking you through this afternoon are found in the third collection, where the Buddha lays out all the regulations that should guide the order of monks and nuns. All of these texts are written in Pali, which is a dialect of Sanskrit that was first standardized somewhere around the 1st to the 3rd century of the Common Era. Now, I began learning Sanskrit in my first year at graduate school at the University of Chicago, and I turned to Pali just before I spent a year in Sri Lanka on a Fulbright grant in 1990 and 91. And I got that Fulbright grant to conduct my dissertation research on the Four Noble Truths. I owe a great deal of debt to Professor Karunatilaka and his wife Kalyani for welcoming me into their home and for all the conversations in Sinhalese that first year. Sinhalese is one of the first languages that is spoken in, one of the 3 languages spoken in Sri Lanka. I spent a wonderful and challenging year with Professor Karunatilaka studying Sanskrit, Pali, and Sinhalese 6 days a week. It would take me 6 hours a day to prepare for 2 hours of lessons with him between 4 and 6. Now, Professor Karunatilaka would wake the household up at 6 a.m. with a tape recording of monks chanting the Ratana Sutta. And this sutta is a discourse from the Tipitaka that extols the virtues of following the 3 gems of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. I learned not only the languages of Buddhism, but also the lived experiences of those languages. Professor Karunatilaka not only taught naive graduate students like us, this is Kevin Traynor and Ann Clark, they both teach at the University of Vermont, but he also taught us how Buddhism lives, how it exists on the ground. Kalyani, his wife, was one who introduced me to the rituals of worship. One of the first things I learned about Karu when arriving in Sri Lanka was that he hadn't set foot inside a Buddhist temple for quite some time. When he went to the temple, he visited the monks. He didn't do the worship that his wife did. So throughout our time that year, I learned that Karu saw his teaching as a kind of religious practice, and the teaching of languages as one way to chip away at the religious and ethnic intolerance that has dominated Sri Lanka since independence. Now, Professor Karunatilaka passed away in late August of this year, and so I had about a 2-week period when I learned of his passing. He had just come to the States to get treatment for his cancer, and so I'd just gone out to his funeral. About 10 days later, I learned that I got this award, and it was just a moment that really took me outside of the usual daily grind of things. So Professor Karunatilaka is really on my mind as I work through this and think about the work and the research that I do. I was very glad that the second book that I co-edited, and this is actually one of my favorite pictures of him. He always had this finger on the chin and sort of looking pensively at things. You'd ask him what he was thinking. He's like, "I'm hungry," you know. So it was just wonderful. So he looks very professorial. He taught at the University of Kelaniya, and he actually got his PhD in linguistics from Cornell, and then went back to Sri Lanka. And I think all of us who were his students, he had taught about 17 or 18 of us, graduate students from all over the, really all over the world, taught us Sinhalese, Pali, and Sanskrit. And so I was very glad that last April, the book that many of you know took forever to appear in print, right? Absolutely forever. And the book finally did appear in print, and this is my colleague Suzanne Rozek, who teaches at Mount Holyoke College, and Suzanne was there at the book launch, and so Carter actually saw the Festschrift that we had done and put together with him. And so this is a picture that I very much treasure. Now, what I learned about religion from Karu and from my time at the University of Chicago is that the usual way of looking at religion as a system of doctrines to which followers grant their belief and faith is far too simplistic. Faith and belief in the teachings of a religious tradition are rarely the single most compelling dimension of a religion. Community and rituals are far more powerful than doctrines alone. I would like to emphasize my point, in part for my students this quarter, that while we are often afraid, as I say, religion eats people's brains, right? When we dig more deeply into those fears, what we find are the most fundamental questions and anxieties that plague us all. While the answers that people receive from religion are sometimes incomprehensible to those outside the faith community, the experiences reflected in a faith tradition are never strange or different. For those of us who are raised in a faith tradition, we learn from the inside out that religion means doing things. Going to church, going to the temple or mosque, worshiping different deities and goddesses, studying, singing, eating together, and cleaning up the dishes. Religion is about people, families, parents, children, grandparents, friends, teachers, priests, nuns, monks, and rabbis. This being so, it may seem odd that I study religious texts. But I came to realize in my formative years of studying religion that what a religion tradition deems to be sacred is always composed, recorded, and passed down within a community. The lived experiences of religion, eating, praying, arguing, and learning, are the experiences that I study when I read these texts. So the images we have, this is an image of Adana for Suniti Karu and Kalyani's son just before he went to graduate school in Cornell in the early 90s. And this slide up in the upper left, I don't know if you can see, is the church that I grew up with. And the experiences are not that far apart. What I learned from Professor Karunatilik and his wife Kalyani were very similar to what I learned from my parents and my own minister, Dr. David Ozen, growing up in the First United Methodist Church in Edmonds, Washington. My mother would write notes on the order of service. The order of service is that piece of paper they give you when you walk into the sanctuary. My mother would write notes on the order of service as David preached each Sunday, and then proceed to make suggestions or question him further on the points that he had made. This is how I grew up, so maybe I didn't come by maybe I did come by this naturally. My grandmother, and my grandmother's no longer with us, but she loved the fact that I was going to graduate school to study religion. She absolutely, she thought it was great. She always believed that my inclination for studying religion ran in the family. She told me a story about how my great-grandmother, Joanna Hutchison, would keep a book about the Rosicrucians just because she was curious. She would read about them before she went to sleep at night. And if any of you know the Rosicrucians, yeah, got it. Now, my grandmother also told me about how she always thought that the evangelical founder of the Foursquare Gospel Church in the late 1920s, sorry, I think I've lost some of my slides here. Had faked her own kidnapping. This woman, her name is Sister Aimee Semple Mcpherson, and she was one of the first. Shreena, you know more about this than I do. All I know is my grandmother's story, but she was one of the first women evangelical preachers, and went to L.A. And just had this huge following, right? But then. I believe it was, May 18th, 1926, she was out supposedly swimming in the Pacific Ocean off of L.A., and she disappeared. And everybody thought she'd been kidnapped. There was a fake ransom note and all of this kind of stuff. And it was just huge, big news all over the West Coast, for about 3 weeks until she showed up in a small village in Mexico. And it said that she'd actually been transported or something odd like this. And the irony here is that we have members of my family who, in fact, attend the Foursquare Gospel Church, and members of my extended family. And so my grandmother took great delight in saying, that was just all a crock, she faked it, she was all a scam, and so on. So it was really interesting. And if you bear with me, here's a picture of... here's a picture of right there on the left. That's Aimee Semple Mcpherson. And then this is a trailer from a film that was made about her life in 2006. So if you can't read it, it says, written out of history. Some believe she was a messenger from God. Others believe she was a fraud. And so these are the kinds of stories that I really grew up with. And so what I think about religion, while it comes from all of my graduate student training, it also comes from my family. And every time we talk about this in class from people who are raised in religious traditions, that's one of the things that we find absolutely fascinating about this field is the dimensions, the people, the passion, the fact that these teachings are always contested. It's not sacrilegious to say that Aimee Semple Mcpherson was a fraud, because this comes with the territory. And much of what I do is want to unpack religion and take it out of that box that we always have it in. It's free to talk. Let's be free to talk about religion. Let's be free to argue about it, and talk about why it is that we believe just what it is that we believe. So, oddly enough, we're going to leap from the 1920s back into probably about the first century in Sri Lanka back into these passages. Now, when I studied Sanskrit and Pali with Professor Karunatilaka, I had little idea that the Tipitaka, the Vinaya Pitaka, contained this passage. It's a huge collection, absolutely mammoth, and there are very few scholars in the world who know everything that is in the entire corpus. So I ran across these sentences in an article actually from the 1950s, and I began to poke around for similar passages in the canon and commentaries, and that's what I do. I read the Pali Canon and the commentaries. I try and place the words in the page in a context, in a place where we see the living tradition behind it. I look for the processes by which they were first written down, the ways in which they are transmitted, and the relationship between particular claims, between one claim in a religious tradition and other claims. So I have translated these sentences that were in the Devanagari script here, and just bear with me, all right? And keep in mind that this is in the equivalent of what Theravada Buddhism calls the Bible, okay? Now, at that time, the marks of a woman appeared on a certain monk. They told the enlightened one, the Buddha, about this matter. He said, "Monks, I say that you can keep the same teacher, the same ordination, the same seniority, but with the nuns. I say that if you've broken any rules that are shared by both monks and nuns, you should atone for those among the nuns. If you have broken a rule that is only followed by monks, there is no offense now that you are a nun." Now, the flip side. Now, at that time, the marks of a man appeared on a nun. They had told the enlightened one about this matter. He said, "Nuns, I say that you can keep the same teacher, the same ordination, the same seniority, but with the monks. And I say that if you have broken any rules that are shared by monks and nuns, you should atone for those among the monks. If you have broken a rule that is only followed by the nuns, there is no offense now that you are a monk." Now, the word that I've translated here as marks is linga. And linga has a whole wealth of meanings. It can refer to the actual sexual genitalia, and that's the way that I've taken it here, and there are arguments to be made for that. But it also means the linguistic marker of gender, so feminine, masculine endings, and it is used to simply refer to gender, what we call gender today, so the cultural constructions of the meanings that we assign to being biologically male and being biologically female. Other common translations besides marks are sign, characteristic, feature, sex, organ, whatever, right? For a long time I had this translated as genitalia of a woman, but it was just like a little too weird, right? So marks it's kind of a nice euphemism, right? But, so any of these terms would work equally well in the translation up here. And that's the point, is that translation is not just about translating the words, but we need to understand, in order to understand the significance of this passage, we need to understand a little bit of the context as well. So, as I've said, these sentences appear in the portion of the rules of the order, the Vinaya Pitaka, that instruct monks and nuns on how to follow the rule on not to have sex. First rule, right? Can't have sex, no sex. Now, the Buddha had quite a lot to say about how monks should not have sex, often in graphic detail, and the detail you would just find absolutely amazing, right? It's like seriously weird, okay? And fascinating all at the same time. All of the rules that monks have to follow on how not to have sex were also applicable to nuns, but there were, of course, additional rules that the nuns had to follow because they were women. Now, the stories immediately preceding these sentences here describe a number of different sexual acts that monks should avoid, and they're always couched as stories. The question raised by this, for example, the Buddha tells us about the story of Upalavana, a nun who was raped by a young Brahmin. The question raised by this anecdote was not whether she was really raped. Everybody agreed that she was really raped. And, unlike today, when we're not sure when rape really is rape, then rape really was rape, right? But the question and the reason that story is included in the Vinaya Pitaka is because the question was whether or not Upalavana got to remain a nun, right? And so this is all about membership in the order. And the Buddha concluded in that story that there is no offense, monks, because she was not willing. So Upalavana was not held to be responsible for the rape, again, slightly more enlightened than we are today in many cases, and she got to remain a nun. So, and the same question is evident here. These passages about a monk or a nun who wake up with the marks of a man or the marks of a woman are literally, we're talking about sex change, right? And so, and I'll take you through some of the commentaries in a few minutes, and the crucial thing here is not whether sex change really occurred, or whether or not the monks or the nuns have broken the rule on how not to have sex. So it's just sort of a compendium of all of the things that you should keep in mind when you're trying to follow the rule on not having sex. And so like Upalavanna, the monk and the nun in this story, they remain ordained, but they have to move house, right? They have to pick up and go to the nunnery or the monastery of the opposite order because they have changed sex. The lesson here is to understand that sex change is considered to be an anomaly, right? Not quite usual, not quite normal. But at the same time, the reason this case is found in this particular section of the texts is that sex change was clearly remembered by the Buddhist teachers and Buddhist redactors to be a real possibility about real monks and about real nuns, and as such, needs to be laid out and talked about and resolved in some way. Now, all of these rules are stories that tell the story of an evolving community of monks and nuns, as unusual as these possibilities may be. Sexual transformation is regarded in this passage as a fact, not common to be sure, but a thing, a human experience that should be dealt with primarily in terms of moving to the properly sexed monastery, and then by breaking as few rules as possible. Now, the story about this explanation by the Buddha on how to deal with sex change gets much more interesting. Thanks to the New Directions Initiative and to Mike Sosolsky's for encouraging me to apply, I've been studying the commentarial Pali so I can now translate a series of commentaries on these sentences. Here we need to realize that the root text from the Vinaya Pitaka is the subject of many, many later commentaries. As I pointed out above, the teachings of religious tradition are never just set forth and believed blindly. They are transmitted, written down, argued about, reinterpreted, and commented upon, in this case, for about 11 centuries. Now, the date that the Vinaya Pitaka was actually written down could have been as early as the 1st century of the Common Era or as late as the 4th century. We know through other texts that there were other commentaries written in the late 4th or early 5th century, so, depending on when, either 100 years or 400 to 500 years after the original texts. In these commentaries, these few sentences receive about 4 pages of elaboration, literally. These 2 sentences, 4 pages on explaining all of them, right? Lucia, you know this. They go into excessive detail in some ways. Now, the author of this first commentary was likely a South Indian by the name of Buddhaghosa, although he never claimed to write the commentary on this himself. We know this from other scholars who have attributed the text to him. And this gets very complicated, and at this point I really do need to thank Cece and Letha. Letha is here somewhere. These are 2 talented librarians who track down obscure articles in Japanese journals written in Japanese, but they have 1 English article somewhere in their pages. They're really absolutely wonderful. Cece is my neighbor. She's a librarian over at Western, and Letha, if you're not familiar, is our interlibrarian librarian here at the college. I could not do the work that I do without them. Now, the tradition remembers that the Buddha declared that monks turned women or monks turned nuns, and nuns turned men still retain their status as nuns or monks, but of the opposite sex. This is never up for debate in any of these commentaries, and that fact is sort of interesting in and of itself, but I don't want to talk about that this afternoon. So when Buddhaghosa wrote his commentaries in the late 4th or early 5th century, what he chose to explain was just how a monk got to remain a nun and how a nun got to remain a monk, right? So commentators doing what commentators do, the author of the Samantapasadika, his commentary on this, explains at length just how sex change might occur according to the Buddhist teachings, and then goes on at even greater length to explain just how a monk turned nun or a nun turned monk might find a hospitable nunnery or monastery in which to reside. Now, the author of this commentary, Buddhaghosa, draws on other arguments from the Buddhist tradition, and I just want to summarize these very briefly. Basically, identity as we know it today and stable beings was not part of the makeup here. There is a category of features, they call them faculties, that human beings are born with. And these faculties include things like the body senses, the mind, the qualities of being masculine, the qualities of being feminine, vitality, happiness, or detachment, faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and if one has done the proper meditation, wisdom. And these are things that one is born with, and you get them from your past lives. So it's the inheritance of your karma. And so Buddhaghosa goes into all of this theory and says basically it's because of your karma that a monk can wake up with the features of a woman one morning. And that's it, right? So he pulls all of this in, and he gives us an explanation for how this can happen. Now, the slipperiness to this here is that usually we think of karma as unfolding from one lifetime to the next. But Buddhaghosa says, no, this is the explanation if you wake up with the genitals of a woman the next morning, or vice versa. And so he wants to make this plausible for his audience. So having first established the rationale for how sex can change, Buddhaghosa then spends a great deal of time talking about how the monk turned nun or the nun turned monk can find a new residence. Because this is the crucial part of it. You have to pick up and move and go find a nunnery or find a monastery, right? So Buddhaghosa looks at this, and these are just some of the commentaries that he has. He says, if there are monks who, this is his sort of fleshing out of those two lines. He says, if there are two monks who live together, having talked about Dharma and recited the suttas or the hymns, who lay down to sleep in the same house and fall asleep, and thus, if female sexual marks appear in one of these monks, there is an offense to sharing a bed with a person of the opposite sex, right? So you've got two monks, they talk about Dharma, they have a good time, they're talking, they stay up late talking, go to sleep, one of them has sex change, then they have broken the rule on, see, this is fascinating stuff. So you have to fix it, right? You have to fix it, and because the whole point of being a monk or nun is not to break the rules, right? And so he goes on. So this is the first part. And he goes on in great detail here. He says, so that one, having woken up and seen the change and being miserable and dejected, even in the middle of the night, the other monk should console him by saying, hey, okay, don't worry. Corrupted states are part of the cycle of life. And this is an accurate translation. That's all I have to say. And so Buddhaghosa is telling that basically, in case you find yourself in this situation, this is how you should handle it, right? And so he goes on. He says, having assured him like this, the monk should say to his friend who has experienced the sex change, it'd be good to go find a nunnery to stay with others. There'll be some friends who are nuns there. If there are nuns like this, or even if there aren't, right, the monk with female sexual marks or female genitalia should say to these nuns, I need help now. I should enter the nunnery for the first time, right? Just incredible detail here. And then one more passage. With that monk or another friend, that one should go to join the nuns who are friends, but the two should not go alone, right? Together with 4 or 5 monks with a torch and staff in hand to guard against breaking the rules about traveling with nuns. You can't have monks traveling together because then lay people look at them and think you're out having a party. Yeah, literally, so you have to be, all of this is about decorum, right? So you take a torch and staff in hand to guard against breaking the rules about traveling with the nuns, saying, we go to thus and such a place. Now, if there's a monastery at a distance beyond the village or across the river, there is no breaking of the rule against going to the villages alone, going to the other side of the river alone, staying away for a night alone, or staying behind a group or alone. So it's all about how to travel together. And then he goes on, so they finally arrive at the nunnery, and so the one who is woken up with the sex change says, sorry, missed my pages here. And so having gone to the nunnery, they should say to the nun, do you know such and such a monk? Think to establish a sort of personal relationship. And the nuns say, yes, venerable ones. So female sexual marks arose in him, now he needs help. And if the nuns say, please come now, we will recite the suttas and listen to Dhamma, then you go and everybody has a good time, right? And literally, this is a how-to manual. It's just a how-to manual. And so if the nuns say this and they're willing to provide help, and those nuns are kind and modest, decorum, modesty being important here, she, the monk turned nun, should stay and not disturb the nuns by breaking any more rules, right? However, if they're modest but they're not kind, then Buddhaghosa says you can go somewhere else, right? And this is the really interesting thing, and I don't want to take up much of your time, but this is another commentary on this issue, and this is from the 12th century. And Sariputra says, so if they're modest but they're not kind, if the monk turned nun is worried because they're not kind, then he or she should go elsewhere because they are not kind. If they are neither modest nor kind, then you still should go somewhere else, right? And one more commentary. from the late 12th century. And this emphasizes something slightly different here. So even if they're kind and modest, but the nuns are disturbed, and they're disturbed because of the sex change, he should find somewhere else. This means that the nuns are upset by the suffering of sex change, and so they don't think of offering assistance. The monks turned nun might even become a householder, but this sex change is an accident, and the monk turned nun should not become a householder because he or she has not broken any of the rules, right? And the interesting thing about this last one is that the commentator is less concerned, concerned about the monk turned nun and the nun turned monk, but is also sort of plausibly offering an explanation for why the nuns or the monks may not want to take this guy in, right? And so the level of detail here is really quite astonishing. Now, by way of conclusion, I would like to thank Zach and Mary. Zach Bauer is the executive director for the Kalamazoo Gay and Lesbian Resource Center, and Mary Harper, our past president. And they're sitting in the back because they didn't tell me they were coming until this morning. But the Resource Center board for the Kalamazoo Gay and Lesbian Resource Center has listened to these translations in different forms because we've had a moment of reflection at the start of our board meetings, and I volunteered a couple of times. They even actually heard the Sanskrit, right, Zach? Yeah, or the Pali. And one of the things that has struck me by this is the whole way that my scholarship has come together with the work that I do in the world. Because one of the topics of conversation that we had at a Faith Alliance prayer breakfast in February was the need for a homeless shelter in Kalamazoo that would welcome LGBT youth, because there is nowhere for them to go in Kalamazoo. And that, I think, is probably the most fundamental aspect of this, is that we have, the Buddha who talked about this. We have Buddha Gosha who wrote in the 5th century. We have Sariputra who wrote in the 12th century. We have Mahakassapa who wrote in the late 12th century about exactly the same issue that we're facing in Kalamazoo. And that kind of coincidence just leaves me breathless. So thank you so much. I appreciate your attention. Can I go sit down now? Yeah, see, Paul, this would have been really good for the building, I'm told. What? Okay, cool. All right, good. Just so long as we're good on this, yeah. Any questions, thoughts, observations? And if there are not, this is perfectly fine. No, this stuff is just amazing, yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, I had a student in my office this morning who asked me that same question. I will. I fell in love with the study of religion when I got to college. I grew up in the United Methodist Church. Sundays, you guys will laugh at this. How many of you know what Young Life is? Anybody? Yeah, Young Life. Yeah, long time. Yeah. Handbell choir. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I remember my mother. Yeah, my mother, she will laugh. My parents couldn't be here today. My dad started to teach a class. He's 81 years old, and he's still teaching. But he had his first day of classes tonight. But my mother, I remember her saying when I was in high school, she's like, don't you think all this Young Life stuff is a little conservative? I'm like, no, Mom. And it was really, thinking back on it, I think it was the circle of friends that drew me to that, as much as the, doctrines and the teaching. But I went to handbell choir. I was in the, the whole thing, whole kit and caboodle. I spent all Sunday, at the Edmonds United Methodist Church. And I went to college, and the very first class I had was Sociology of Religion, and you guys will appreciate this. Peter Berger, Sacred Canopy. And I remember, and if anybody knows, I've tried to teach Peter Berger to students, doesn't work, right? And he talks about the dialectic, the dialectic between community, practice, and questions of truth and faith and evil. And he talks about the dialectical move. And I honestly just fell in love with it. I remember looking up the word dialectic in a dictionary right? You know, like my first 2 weeks in college, what does this mean? And, you know, like any college student, you guys will see, all of my students have heard these stories before, so pardon me for the repetition. Jamie's like grinning. But it took me until the fall of my senior year to actually realize that I could do this for a living, you know. And I went in to talk to my advisor, and Daryl said, you know, I was wondering when you were going to figure this out. I'm like, Daryl, you could have told me, you know. You could have suggested. He's like, no, you have to come to it yourself. So you guys who are here, we do really a lot better by you guys than they did by me. You know, you had to find your own major when I was in college, you know. But I just loved religion, and I took a year off. I did some traveling. I actually went to Findhorn, which is a New Age community in Scotland. I spent some time there. And all the questions I have, and they really do come from my family, but it's fascinating. I just find it absolutely fascinating. I got into the University of Chicago, slogged my way through graduate school, and you know, I always talk about myself as sort of a reluctant scholar of Buddhism, because when it came time to picking a dissertation, area for my dissertation research, I sort of looked at. I had done Zoroastrianism. I had done a little bit of Middle Persian. The one scholar who did Zoroastrianism was at Harvard, and he was a noted misogynist. And everybody I said, no, you don't want to go work with him. He just won't work. So, and I had done more work in Buddhism, and I'd been doing Sanskrit and Pali all the way along, and so found a dissertation topic, and I love what I do. I absolutely love what I do. But yeah, so it was really just falling in love with the study of it. I remember thinking that first class, my first semester in college, that, oh my gosh, you can think about this stuff. You don't always have to do it, And that was really, it. But then I read Pierre Bourdieu and realized that thinking about something is doing it anyway. So, it's not just a life of the mind. But it's really, finding this latest set of texts and stuff is just mind-boggling. And really, when I was starting to teach here at Kalamazoo College, there was very little. Actually, I was co-chair of the Feminist Lesbian Issues in Religion group for the American Academy of Religion, and we always tried to do non-Christian stuff, right? But I was one of the few people, and there was a woman who was also a scholar of Buddhism, and she was probably 10 or 15 years older than I am. She's like, oh, there's nothing in Buddhism. And so when I finally found this stuff about 10 years ago, I'm like, oh, honey, you were so wrong. Because this is just amazing. And we finally have a handful of scholars, Jose Cabazon at Santa Barbara, right? Yeah, Santa Barbara, with Ann Taves, is working on this from the Tibetan side. As best as I can tell, I'm about the only one who's working on it on the Pali side. And so it's really just amazing stuff. So I love the study of religion. I love seeing what it does. I love talking about it. And I really do have a passion to teach students and to teach people that we can talk about religion. We don't have to be afraid of it, right? We don't have to be defensive about it. We don't have to run away from it. We don't have to think it's weird or strange. And while it's really colloquial, I say it, I say religion doesn't eat people's brains, right? Didn't I say that this afternoon, Sarah? Yeah. So, because what it means to be religious is a complicated and wonderful and amazing thing. And I'm very honored to be able to have the opportunity to do that, work with such wonderful students and such just exquisite colleagues, all of you. So thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here, listening to Carol, particularly listening to her ending, where she brought the passion of her scholarship to something real in the world. Of course, first reminds me of President Hoban, and that notion that what we try to do here is to help our students develop the spirit and the discipline of a scholar to make the world somewhat better. Carol, you do that by your teaching, you do that by your activism, and we thank you. And in honoring Carol, I hope that all of the faculty here recognize that we honor all of you, because each of you do this in your own unique and special way. So we thank you, And Carol, this is just a token of our appreciation. Thank you all so much for being with us. There may still be a bit of reception outside, and I'm sure that Carol will answer questions quietly and we'll be happy to spend time with you. Thank you so much for being here.